and welcome everyone. I am Emily Lanto. I'm the curator and director of the DeVos Art Museum. Thanks so much for coming out on this rainy night to celebrate local art and artists. Before I introduce Cortney Lederer, who's standing next to me, the juror, I just want to touch on a couple programming notes. Tonight we're opening 4 exhibitions. One exhibition is Everyday Sublime. It's using our permanent collection to talk about the sublime. Another is the geometry and gesture of Karen Guzak's prints in the back, and then also a Rabbit Island focus exhibition in addition to North of the 45th. And all of these exhibitions and programs happen because of you and your support, so we are ever so grateful for that support. Tonight, we are here to welcome Cortney Lederer, and Cortney is an amazing dynamo. She is a Chicago arts-based consultant, an advocate, and a project manager with 16 years of experience managing an array of artistic programming for organizations and businesses. From 2011 to 2014, she served as the director of exhibitions and residencies at the Chicago Arts Coalition, which is a really great Chicago artist support system for artists and curators, where she designed and managed 2 of its residency programs, Hatch and Bolt. In 2014, she launched CNL Projects, which provides project-based consulting for organizations with a specialization in curating, project management, and project design and development. CNL has worked with notable organizations such as 3 Arts, Chicago Artists Coalition, Lil Street Art, Expo Chicago, Fashion Outlets of Chicago, LinkedIn, Wilson Sporting Goods, Pierpoint Financial, Hyatt Hotels, corporate office, and she also provides professional development workshops and artist consultations. So she really does the whole shebang. She additionally works at SAIC, and she's curated 3, which the Chicago Art Institute, she's curated 3 master's program exhibitions there, and she also teaches in the graduate school in the Arts Administration and Policy program. Cortney received her BFA in sociology from George Washington University and a BFA from Victoria, and a dual master's degree in modern art history, theory, and criticism and arts administration and policy from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And currently she serves on the board of Every House Has a Door, the educational advisory committee for the Chicago Arts Coalition, programming and advisory committee for Snow City Arts, and is an art table member. I'd also like to give thanks to Travel Marquette for helping support this program, and North of the 45th, and to all of you, and let's welcome Cortney.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Emily, for the very warm, generous welcome. I thought I would just start by asking how many folks in the room identify themselves as an artist, whether it's just inwardly, I dabble in it, to I actually am a practicing artist. Great, so the majority of the room, that's great, because that's mostly what I'm sort of talking to for today. I was given the opportunity to talk openly about a topic of my choice, which is both really an exciting opportunity, but also can be challenging to pick and choose. But I wanted to first say just thank you for hosting me today and for inviting me to jury this exhibition. It was such an incredible opportunity to be exposed to so much new artwork. So jurying often is that great opportunity, even as an artist, if you are applying to something that might seem to be a reach, it's great because at the very least you're getting exposure to someone who is now familiarizing themselves with your work. So that's always, I think, an added bonus to that. And so on the flip side of that, I'm introduced to such a wide variety of experiences and backgrounds, disciplines, and practices, and that was a real treat for me to have. Secondly, this is the first time I've been to Marquette, and so this opportunity brought me and my family here. We made it into a vacation, and that's been a real gift, and we really enjoyed ourselves thoroughly. So I have a couple more days before we have to leave, and even with the rain, we've been enjoying this environment so much. And I will say that just being here, it was really helping for me to understand why the notion of place was coming out so much in many of the artists' work, and why place is such an inspiring piece of material for artists to work with here. And I see that now for myself, not only in the work, but also just in being here physically, and find that very inspiring. So as I was thinking about what kind of topic I wanted to discuss today, a lot of what I thought about is the notion of storytelling. So because so much as artists, oftentimes our work is our story, right? Or we're telling stories with our work. So thinking about it in that realm, and then also thinking about the story that I'm sharing with you today, a little bit about myself, my background, and also thinking about how that applies to you as artists to think about not only the artwork and that story that work is sharing onto itself, but how do you share through the various platforms to get people to even see your work? What's the story you tell to invite folks to build audiences to actually get the work outside of the studio? So all this kind of came down to the same notion of just storytelling. So I have just some random images that I'm going to place behind that may have some connection to what I'm talking about or may not. But you can always daze off if what I'm saying is not appealing into the image itself. I thought I'd give a brief background about myself and sort of my experience. I know Emily kind of gave a bit of a bio, but I thought I'd dig into that just a little bit to give some context as to why I'm here. But more importantly, thinking about what I want to focus on is really my model and approach to the way that I work, and the principles and values that I use, because I think that is what I think perhaps that could be useful. Some of the values that I share in the work that I do also might be applicable to how we think about ourselves as artists working with their various curators, producers, museum professionals, other academics. How do we use those value systems and principles and ways of working to think about the way that we work with others? Hopefully, in the end, to build a sustainable and healthy field. So a little bit about myself. Art has always been a central part of my life. My parents exposed me to art by taking me to performances in the city of I'm from Chicago, so performances in the city of Chicago, art exhibitions, things like that. And you really start to think about how critical exposure really is to having access to art and what that means. My grandfather was also a full-time artist, and now my dad is retiring into being an artist as well. I went to school to study sociology. I kind of diverted away from the arts, thinking I wanted to do something else, but I minored in photography and ended up spending most of my time in the darkroom, even though my major was really focused on sociology. I went and moved back to Chicago following that degree, was working with youth and cultural programming, and realized that I really wanted to be in the arts. But the only way to do that for me I needed more education, or at least I felt I needed more education. That's not to say that I actually don't believe very strongly in self-taught artists. I personally just needed sort of the guidance and help to get there. So I went to school and pursued a BFA and focused mostly on sculpture and installation-based work. But it was there, while I was in school, that I took my first curatorial course. They offered it at this university, and I started to realize how I had such an affinity towards producing and towards working at supporting artists in their practices versus me being in a studio, which I adored, but I felt that my place was somewhere else. So I moved back to Chicago once again and decided to apply to the School of the Art Institute, where I was surprisingly accepted to their dual master's program in art history and arts administration. And while I was there, I wanted to really use that opportunity, and I was older when I went to grad school. I wanted to use that opportunity to start to understand the art ecosystem and really to explore as much as I could to build community and build relationships. So I used the opportunity of school to start to do that. And what that meant for me is I started to work with as many organizations as I possibly could. I started working with a commercial gallery in Chicago, free, interning. I started volunteering for a dance company. I was trying to expose myself not only to build community and build relationships, but to also understand where it was that I fit in. And the big learning for me around all of that was it wasn't so much about the discipline itself, it was about finding work that actually moved me. So it wasn't necessarily about, oh, I have to work or identify with a performance arts organization or performance arts or visual arts specifically, but it was really about, let me find the work that moves me, that makes me think, that expands my thinking about the world that we live in, because that in its essence is what I really believed art has the power to do. So upon graduating from this school, and this is just a little bit of a bio, but upon graduating from school, because I worked so hard to build relationships, I had the opportunity right upon graduating to start managing a dance company in Chicago, I managed a contemporary puppeteer company, I worked at the School of the Art Institute. I kind of floated through a variety of jobs, but all the jobs came from those relationships that I had formed and built. And one day I got a call about the Chicago Artists Coalition from 3 different people saying, there's a job here for you. It's a job that's circulating internally, and we think you'd be perfect for it. Now, I had never done anything in a nonprofit like this before, but it was something I was ready for, and it's because I kept reminding people that I was looking for a job, and I did that regularly. Again, coming back to the notion of relationships and community. So I took this job at the Chicago Artists Coalition, which was an organization that was formed in the 70s, really started by artists and was an arts advocacy organization. But in the 2000s, and by 30 years later, 30 plus years later, it was becoming quite dead. It wasn't quite as active as it had been, and it was ready to be revitalized and renewed. And so it started with a new executive director, and then I came in on board as a director of exhibitions and residencies. And we moved to a new space, and because of this new space, we're able to start 2 residency programs. So I was able to design, without ever doing this before in my life, but design 2 artist residencies that are still in existence today. And part of that came from, and the only reason why those residency programs are successful today is because of the artists that were open enough to talk to me on a regular basis, to share their needs, to really collaborate to brainstorm what these residency programs could be. And that's very much how I function today, is working very collaboratively to design programs. This is just an exhibition that took place in one of the residencies. So these are urban residencies. A lot of times when we think about artist residency programs, which there are plenty of, you might go somewhere to a new space to have quiet, to have studio space, and to work. In this case, this is an urban residency that was built on how do I sort of focus on my artistic practice, have community, have professional development, have exhibition while managing the rest of my life, right? Because oftentimes it's hard to be able to leave your life to go on a residency, whether it's for a weekend to 6 months to a year. But I'll get into that a little bit more because I do think those experiences are very, very valuable, and they're becoming more doable with support for families and things of this nature. So I'll supply you with some resources there. But in any case, so I designed a residency program that was built on 4 things. I went down inside a basement of a building, I took tape, I went across the floor and divided it up into open studio space. I made that a positive by saying this is great because now artists will have the opportunity to build community and share ideas and potentially collaborate because there are no walls. That wasn't really a choice in the matter, but it's something that I just made a resource because it was the only option that we had. Luckily, we attracted a wonderful cohort of artists to start that first year. They had this open studio space. They were granted solo exhibitions. It was a year-long program, so we'd grant and support them with solo exhibitions. We brought in curators and academics and other artists to meet with them on a regular basis in their studios, the idea being that hopefully that would lead to other opportunities. And then we held monthly potlucks where we brought artists together to host community gatherings, to provide one another with critique, to provide one another with support, to share resources, and to share ideas. So that was what one of the residency programs was about. And the second was thinking about how there's not that much support for those who are looking to produce exhibitions, curators, producers, other creatives, or other artists who are interested in producing exhibitions. How do we have a residency program where people can test and experiment with those ideas? So I started both a curatorial and artist residency called HATCH Projects. There were 24 artists accepted into a year-long program. We brought in 4 emerging curators, and then we paired up those curators with mentor curators, more established, maybe museum professionals or other experimental curators that could help support them seeing through some exhibitions throughout the year. So those were some of the programs that I was doing, and while I was there, I also started a Midwest Artist Exchange where we partnered with other cities. It wasn't a completely sustainable program, but we worked with Powerhouse Productions in Detroit as a partnering organization. We worked with the Soap Factory in Minnesota. And it was just a great way to bring artists from various within the region together to talk about how we could further collaborate and build ideas. While I was in this position, I also would get calls from folks outside of the art world, right? So because of the name of the organization, we would get calls from various corporations, hotels, restaurants, people who are looking to connect with artists in some capacity but didn't know how to do that. And those organizations, that would kind of fall into my job category. And I say that because that's what really led me into the position that I am in now. And I also say that because working outside of the art zones became a really interesting point, and I call it art zones, but if we think about traditional art zones of like spaces like this, museums, universities, galleries, fairs, all of these are sort of operating within traditional, what we might call traditional art zones. And those are really important critical spaces for all of us to operate in within this field. And we also know that they're very limiting, right? They can only serve a select number of artists. Galleries can only serve how many exhibition and museum shows can be granted to artists, right? Also thinking about, and same with galleries, right? How many galleries can represent X amount of artists? So how do we start to think about what happens outside of those spaces? If we believe that art has the power to change and transform the way that we're thinking about the world, might it not be important to consider how art can exist outside of the traditional sort of gallery museum walls? And how can we as artists, and I say we, but I'm not a practitioner, how can artists start to think about how their work might exist outside of there? Are there various iterations of work that you do that might, or is it the same work that, feeling again authentic to your practice, might be able to exist outside of these modes, to reach new audiences, to develop new conversations, and to ultimately inform the work in a maybe different way that opens up new opportunities for yourself. So I became really interested in that, and about 3.5 years after working for this organization, I also had a family. I had a young one and another on the way, and the schedule that I created for myself out of nothing was not sustainable for someone with a family. So I decided to just slap a name on my new organization and email a bunch of folks and say, I'm starting what I had called initially CNL Art Consulting. If you're in need of my services, just let me know. But I didn't really know what those services were going to be. But I had, again, spent a lot of time working with people and developing relationships that when I left that organization, some opportunities started to fall into place. One of those being teaching at the School of the Art Institute in a graduate department in arts administration, which was great because it sort of fell into my mission of being able to help to teach future arts administrators how to further invest in artistic practice and artist careers. And then I started getting a bunch of calls for, again, some of the things that we were talking about in my bio, is to do some site-specific and create dynamic art programs for organizations and corporations. So in this case, this is not the best image, but this is Wilson Sporting Goods. So Wilson Sporting Goods was moving from one location to another into the city of Chicago in a big building called the Prudential Building, and they wanted something that would tell their vision and to help dictate their story through using their materials of sporting goods. So I helped to identify artists, and I managed the entire process of identifying 2 artists who worked collaboratively to create this sort of captivating on-site installation that told the story of Wilson Sporting Goods. Here's another example of Hyatt Hotels corporate headquarters, which is located in Chicago. They were also moving their space, and they were interested, and they have 1,100 employees in this location. They wanted art to be a part of their building, and they wanted art to also help to relate to their employees in the building, and how do employees start to think about their work they're doing in relationship to the way that artists might approach their own creative practice. And that's something I tried to drive home a lot. So I worked with artists. I went to artist studios and bought work straight out of the artist studios. I went to galleries to create, quite a big program for them there. But also they wanted to do a heritage wall installation using relics from the 60s to tell their story of their business. So I found an artist who is able to work in that capacity to take their old photographs and their old relics and ephemera to tell the story of the Hyatt Hotels. And then I'll do something where I'm working in a more traditional mode of working with what Ruben Aguirre, who used to identify as a graffiti artist, now a kind of contemporary muralist. This is LinkedIn's office in Chicago. They were building a new space, and they wanted something on site that would, again, thinking about in a more abstract sense who they are as a company. The fashion outlets of Chicago, really, it was a mall. They wanted to draw new collectors, and it's by the airport in Chicago. How do we get people out there? Maybe art is the way to do that, right? So all these people who are kind of thinking about art as a way to connect with others in some capacity. And again, all of these artists who have maybe museum practices or have showed their work in galleries, but were really interested, surprisingly, in showing their work outside of the context. What happens when I have my work in a mall? What does that look like? And how does that change and inform the work that I have? And what, these display cases were specifically built for that. So this is just some examples of some of the work that I have done. Another aspect of the work that I do is project management. So in this case, I partnered with, or I didn't partner with, but the Expo Chicago, which is the art fair here in Chicago, was partnering with the Palais de Tokyo in Paris to do an off-site exhibition during the run of the fair. They didn't have the capacity to sort of manage both simultaneously, so I was brought on to help to oversee this exhibition, which was quite stunning and quite an honor to work with, and manage all the programming there. So this was in this new space as part of the DuSable Museum of African American History, and a space that had never really been open to the public. So this exhibition opened it up to the public. It was representing Chicago artists as well as a group of French artists as well. And then, yes, another aspect of my work is providing professional development programming to artists in a variety of capacities. So nonprofit organizations will invite me to do talks on, strategic planning for artists, professional development, program design, project management, things of that nature. So that's just a little bit of background, or a lot of bit of background on what I do, but all of this comes back to the same real belief system. And it's that I believe that artists deeply impact and shape our communities, that artists identify alternative ways of thinking and bring new ideas to the forefront in innovative ways, and ultimately that artists have the ability to engage our imagination and make meaningful, deep change. And that's at the core of what I believe in, is the foundation of everything I do. And the principles that really guide all that, which I keep saying over and over again, are really coming down to the relationships that I have with artists and the relationships I have with my clients, the notion of trust, community, and collaboration. And I really believe that those sort of guiding principles, or those values, if you'll call them, are things that are all applicable to the way that we might approach even our artwork and our art making and our art practice, right? How do we use those as a way to connect with others outside of our studios? So how do we think about then, how do I select the artists that I work with, right? Because there are so many. I don't represent any artists. I'm really interested in supporting as many artists as I possibly can. So number one, the artwork has to be compelling and relevant and make sense with the project, with the context of the project, right? And the artists that I work with, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, have to care somewhat about the audience. They have to have some invested interest in what they want the audience to walk away with from the work, right? Otherwise, oftentimes, then what is the work doing outside of the studio, right? If we don't care, why are we putting it out in the world? There is something there, whether we want to admit it or not. How do we connect with audience if we're choosing to put it outside of the studio walls? The artists I work with have to exhibit kindness. These all seem like really self and basic sort of principles, but they're actually really, really essential, because in situations where an artist is not kind or not easy to work with, it's just not worth it, no matter how fabulous the work is. And it'll make or break an artist's career, right? Because the art world's small, as we all know, and word travels very quickly. So again, that kind of leads into the second 2 points, that the artist must be professional. How are they communicating also about who they are, whether it be through a, whatever platform, whether it's through email exchanges or whether through it's in person, whether it's through social media, what have you. How are we effectively communicating about who we are as artists, and how is that maintained professionally? Because as I'm working in my company, I have to know that, the artists I'm working with are also a reflection of who I am. And I want to make sure that that is as seamless as possible. And ultimately, as I talked about, a lot of the folks that I'm working with, not always, but in cases where I'm working with folks that are not necessarily in the art world, I know that there's going to be a lot of changes along the way because there's a growth process for them. They have to understand and be educated about art, and that's part of my job, is to make sure that I'm advocating for the artists and that I'm really communicating clearly. But there's always changes that need to be made throughout the project, and so I have to work with someone that's going to be flexible and able to adapt to those changes along the way. And that's hard to do, right? As you're an artist and making a work that you know is the work that needs to be there. And it's hard for me to do too. But it is an essential sort of process as we, even putting an exhibition up, that the minute the work goes from studio to the exhibition space, most of the time things change. It just looks different. The space becomes huge all of a sudden, or the space shrinks in size. So how do you sort of become flexible? And artists are really experts at that. I mean, you have to do it in the making of your work all the time. So in most cases, I would say that's a lucky quality that many artists already have. So thinking about this then, and all of this that I'm sort of talking about in general, what are artist considerations that one can think about or might consider as you approach your work outside of studio? I think one of the most essential points, and I talk about this all the time to my arts administrators, to myself, and it's an ongoing practice, but taking the time to define and understand why you do what you do. And breaking that down to its most essential components. So has anyone here heard of, I did not mean to have that transition. But has anyone heard of Simon Sinek, Start With Why? I highly recommend checking him out. There's like a shortened version and a TED Talk, but he also has a book called Start With Why. It's a little jargony to watch, can come across as a little marketing-ish. But the essentials of it are really, really there. And the notion is, and he takes these concentric circles to describe it, so that most people know what they do, right? That's how we approach one another oftentimes. So what do you do, right? It's like one of the first questions that we ask, and we start there. And as an artist, you might say, I make paintings, or I'm a multidisciplinary artist, or what have you, right? That's one way. And he argues that, some organizations, and you have to translate a little bit of this here, but some organizations or people know how they do it, right? And these are the things that make them special or set them apart, right? I use paint, or I dance, or whatever the case may be to describe the work that you do. But he argues that very few people are able to articulate, I should say. Most people know, but the practice of articulating why you do what you do, and that's what sets you apart from the rest, and that's what makes you inspiring, and that's what actually inspires others to be a part of what it is that you are doing. So how do we think about that in terms of our own artistic practice, right? Or how do I think about that in terms of my business? And it played a really pivotal role in me thinking about how do I even articulate what it is, the work that I do. I don't just say what I do. I start with thinking about what it is I believe in first, and then everything else has to sort of fall into place from there. Right? If it doesn't fall into that belief system, into that vision, it doesn't really make sense. So the idea is that you start with really thinking about, why am I an artist? Why am I making this work? And you keep breaking it down until that question cannot be answered anymore. And once you have the answer to the question, it becomes interesting to think about then, okay, well, now that I understand why, how am I going to communicate that why, right? How do you want to communicate that why with the world, with whom, and how often, right? So in the studio, maybe you know why that is, and you're working, and it feels very close to you, but how are you getting that outside of there? And that really does and could become your marketing strategy and your plan. And for many of us, that language can become very unattractive. Maybe it's not. So I ask you, or I challenge you, then to translate that. Translate that marketing strategy to, how do I want to tell my story? And then you own that. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. And for many of you, you may be experts in this. For many of you, that might not even appeal to you. But again, if you want your work to be outside of the studio, how are you connecting with others? It's as simple as that, right? That could be the answer to that question. I'm going to kind of get us through over here. So again, you can translate this notion of marketing and strategy. And I'm just going to put these all up instead of. Okay. So, if marketing leaves you feeling uneasy, you want to reconsider how you approach it, right? Instead of thinking of it as an exercise in self-promotion, think of it as an exercise in self-definition. How do you want to define yourself? And make it authentic to you. Again, you don't have to use the language of marketing, right? You can use it as the language of storytelling, coming back to what we were talking about from the very beginning. And how do you do that in a way that parallels your own creative process? And also, your story is really your art. And if you don't own that and you don't take control of it, there's the possibility that someone else will do that for you, right? Because there's social media, there's other ways of communicating the work that you do. So how do you jump ahead of that and start to tell your own story? It's also a reflexive process, meaning that the more that you're able to sort of dig in and think about how do I want to communicate about the work that I'm doing to other people, you start to really hone in on thinking more deeply about the work that you're doing and getting really good at articulating that. And that can bring about new ideas and impact the work in other ways. And you can start doing that by creating a self-inventory of what's important to you. You can write that down. And that's where the story begins, right? Starting to isolate, what is important here? What do I want to share? What are the most essential parts? And, again, you've made an enormous investment of time into your art, right? So how promoting your work honors that commitment. And it helps to further, and it helps you become a part of that creative process. And then ultimately it helps to build community. By starting to invite others into your work, you're expanding your network. And a lot of that terminology can feel a little bit, maybe to some of you, not appealing. But ultimately, it is about, as you start to expand your network and build community, that's what I really believe leads to other opportunities for yourself. You just don't know what happens the minute you start exchanging with other folks and exchanging ideas. New collaborations may unfold. And then another piece is just to also thinking about your audience, right? Who do you want to reach? There are two sort of ways of looking at audiences. There's your core and there's your target. Your core are folks that are already your supporters. They're those that maybe are sitting in this room. They already maybe know some of your work. They're excited by what you're doing, but you've got to nurture that core, because without that, those are your ambassadors, and you really want to take advantage of them. Without nurturing that, you may lose them. So when you have an opening coming up and you want your colleagues to attend, don't assume that they're going to attend. How do you really make that personal ask to connect with them to get them to be there? And then thinking about your target audience, right? How do you start to think about who are those that my dream list of who I want to bring into the core? Who do I want to start to build new connections with? And how do I get there? One of the ways you can do that is just by making that list and starting to research, okay, what have they done lately? What are the exhibitions? Or is there a dance show? Or whatever it is that you're interested in, and starting to connect with them over social media, understand who they are, and then creatively, reach out to them in some capacity to invite them. And, I think there's absolutely nothing to lose by doing that. It's their job for the producers or the curators or the gallerists or the museum directors. It's their job to be knowing what's happening out in the world. And if they're off put by receiving an email from you, oh well. I mean, that's something reflective of themselves more than really being excited and thinking about supporting the field, right? So taking the risk to reach out to some of those folks is really important. I gave a presentation, I didn't give the presentation, but I hosted a presentation of a bunch of art critics and writers. A lot of the artists in my program were really interested in saying, okay, this is one of the biggest exhibitions that I've had personally. How do I get a review written? How am I going to get someone to write about my work? So we brought a bunch of folks in who were writers on a panel to talk about just that. And one of the things that they had shared is, I get inundated with emails all the time about invitations to show, and that's fine, and I look at them, but the things that stand out are those personal notes, right? So one of the things that I suggested to a lot of the artists in my program after hearing this and after really learning about that is, what can you do? Pick 5 to 10 folks that you want to be there. And could you make, if you're a photographer, or even if you're not a photographer, could you make a tiny collage, or could you take a piece of a larger photograph, cut it, and write a personal note in the back and send it to that person's office and address them personally? We all know that when we're addressed personally or invited to something, it gives you a sense of, I don't know, for me, it gives me a sense of belonging, and I feel connected, and I feel more interested or compelled to at least check it out, or at the very minimum, I will remember it. So how do you create that personal sort of relationship with those that you want to invite in to be a part of your work? And if you get one from that, it's worth it, even if you get one response from that. So coming back to, away from the marketing and then back to everything we were just sort of talking about, is again, and of course, like sort of artist considerations. Yes, you want to be in your studio, and you should be in your studio, and you want to devote time to the place that you love most. You just don't want to feel isolated there. You don't want to spend too much time on your own. So what do you do, right, to break out of that if that's the case, right? Can you think about having open studios and invite people in on a regular basis? Could you think about having studio visits? And that same notion of what I just said, if you wanted to, you create that target list of who you want to invite into your studio, and you start to think about, how do I address that person and invite them to become a part of this? They come, great. If they say no, that's okay, but at least I'm trying and putting myself out there. How do you form crit groups, right? Another way to get ongoing feedback with your work so that your work can continue to grow. Can you connect with other artists and say, once a month, we're gonna hold ourselves accountable to meeting here, shift studios, whatever that is, and whatever's authentic to that group of folks to help increase not only community, but helps to also build your work. And then, again, coming back to the notion of risks, of being able to take risks regularly and consistently and challenge yourself outside of your comfort zone, which is something that I try to push myself to do all the time in a variety of capacities, and it's not easy. But it's something that pushes me to new opportunities, I do believe. And then thinking about self-care, I know it's a big topic today, folks are talking about all the time, but how do we integrate it into our daily life? What does that mean for each of us? And it's different. How do we integrate taking care of ourselves in some capacity regularly? And how are we relentless about quality? That's something I practice in my own business. I can't let that quality ever fail. That's an important value. And how do we display routine excellence in everything that we do? So with that, I thought I would end there. Those are just some general thoughts and feedback that I have, and I thought I would open it up. I don't know why I need to get to the slide that says questions, but I'll put it on the board. Does anyone have any questions? I missed it. Or any thoughts? Yes.
Just thinking about in the context of this jury show, there, familiar with like art deadlines list, there's all of these things for jury shows out there. And do you have advice for artists as far as navigating like what to choose to put your work out into as far as juried exhibitions? Do you have guidance, advice, like research?
I mean, I think like just as I tell like artists who are interested in having gallery representation or showing work at a gallery, I would say in the same advice there is do your research and find what the opportunities are, and look at the work that has been exhibited in the past and see if your work is you could imagine your work within that space in some capacity. But at the same time, jurying is so subjective, and there is a rhyme and reason and there's not, right? So every jury will, if they're changing yearly, which most likely they will, or whatever the time period is, I would say it's worth continuing to apply, unless it's so outside of the realm of the discipline that you're working in, and it's like, there's nothing else here that is anything like my work, that might not be worth your time. But if there is work that you see an affinity and you're thinking, I could see my work potentially here, it's worth the risk of doing it. For sure. I mean, I think in this exhibition, as you see, there's such a wide range, but that's what this exhibition is about. There was no one discipline. It was really open, and so therefore this exhibition could reflect that, and therefore I think in many cases a variety of artists and a variety of backgrounds could apply. I did want to mention one other thing too, about artist residency programs. The Alliance of Artist Communities is a great resource. It's an umbrella organization for all artists, or one of the umbrella organizations for all residency programs, and they have a tremendous list of resources, residency programs with all the deadlines across the United States and outside the United States, and for writers, to those with families, to, I mean, every discipline you can imagine. And it's a great way to sort of think about, okay, well, maybe I do want to have some of that opportunity to step outside my comfort zone, or to be in a new environment where I can focus and hone in on my studio practice. Artist residencies are really, really useful. I know it's a little bit of a sideline, but I wanted to add that as another resource. Yeah. Oh.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of jurying this particular exhibition? What kind of principles and values guided you, or what kind of themes stuck out to you as you went about the process?
It was really hard. I mean, if I had the opportunity to have everyone in the exhibition, I think I would. But there wasn't, so there was a limited number. And I don't know that I can say, like, here is an exact pattern, but the principles, I mean, I want to be able to show the array. What I was seeing from those that applied, I want to show as much as I possibly can the breadth and depth of work that is represented in this region, whether it be craft to something very, very contemporary. And so I did my best to sort of go through what was available to do that, but also thinking about, importantly, is knowing this is a curated exhibition that would be in one space. How are these works all communicating with one another? And will the conversation and the dialogue between the works be effective, right? And that's something that we always have to think about as curators, is how are the works communicating with one another? And a lot of, I think, the curators here on site actually did a lot of that work by thinking about the placement, because that's a huge, huge piece. But it was a really, really challenging task, and not all the work would be in, and that's hard. But yes, I think for the most part, just being able to dictate a sense, what I saw is coming through a sense of place, and that's a very open-ended sort of topic. But I think that a lot of the work speaks to that together very well by showing the depth of what that looks like for the variety of disciplines, experiences, and backgrounds of artists that are living within this region. But not all, right? Sadly. Did you have a question?
That was kind of my question, but maybe to follow up on your response too. So place seems like the main theme, but maybe not the only one. Are there other themes that you sorted through in going through this work that came up that maybe didn't make it, or were compelling, or did make it in the show? Is it place? Is that really what ties it together? The organization has some other kind of
yeah. I mean, I don't know. Place is just the most, in exhibitions like this, to be honest, like the curatorial piece of it can be really, really hard. It's needed and it's necessary to kind of, for an audience to help tie it together. But at the same time, what happens if you walk into a space and you just see this work? What would be the story that all of us would have? I don't know, right? It might be really, because I'm not going to be dishonest about that. It's like, it's really challenging, because not only that, I'm seeing all this work. I don't have any background on anyone. I have no names. I have no gender, which is great, because I can't look up anybody. But I'm also, again, all transparency, I'm looking at work all online on a screen. And that's a really challenging experience, because it's so different than being able to walk into an artist's studio and experience the work and understand the work in the context in which you're seeing it. So the benefit of an exhibition like this is like, you get to open it up to such a wide public, a wide variety of artists. And the challenge with that is, because it's such a huge array of artists, number of artists, the juror is limited in their ability to experience the work, right? And that's always going to be the case in these types of exhibitions. So I'm answering your question, and I'm not, but I'm also saying, like, you know what I mean? I think it's so challenging, and I would say to anyone in this room who was in the exhibition or not in the exhibition, it's one of those things that you just keep applying to, because every single person that is jurying it is going to have a different curatorial approach, if you will, if we can really even call it that, right? Because it's loosely curatorial in a way, because you're looking on screen and you're identifying, versus if I were to go into every single artist, hundreds of artists that applied and gone into each studio, the experience of that would change dramatically, probably how the work was curated, I believe. And that's a huge thing. I mean, I tell this to artists all the time too, is part of the reason I believe that that collectors start to purchase artists' work is really being able to put a face to the work. It shouldn't always be that way, but it's true, and the story to the work. So the more often you can get that person inside your studio, it just changes it, because people all of a sudden feel that human connection. They understand the work in a totally different context than what they're seeing on screen. On the flip side of that, so many folks are buying work online, right? So you kind of got to balance yourself and play all your cards in that respect. Yeah, it's my very honest real answer. Yes.
So it's sort of to piggyback on that question.
Yeah.
In terms of what you thought you were creating online as an exhibition, how does that compare to what you see that you've created in person? I mean, I haven't seen the show yet because you just drove here from Minneapolis. So,
Oh,
you know,
great.
So, but you probably have.
Yeah, I had a chance to walk through it just before the talk, actually. I was really excited and pleased, but it has a big part to do with how the show was laid out, and that was not done by me. So that was the curatorial team here. But I felt very, very pleased. And it is one of those instances where I felt like, and I might be contradicting myself throughout this whole answers of all these questions, but it's just what I'm thinking and feeling is that, in looking at it online, you're creating these you're not seeing it all together. It's impossible unless I were to print every one and lay it out, and maybe that would be one option. But just thinking about it, imagining the various works that are there, that I'm seeing and selecting from, to be able to see them in person, it's like, it works. Like, these works really have these interesting conversations with one another. But I think at the same time, oftentimes, what happened if a different work was subbed in that I didn't originally select? That could potentially have another interesting conversation. But a lot of it has to do with the way that it was laid out. In some cases, I see its context. In some cases, I see its subject matter. In others, its palette, right? Because the range of work in the show, it's pretty huge. Anything from like a jewelry to a very contemporary painting. And so how do those things exist in one room? And I find those conversations to be very, very interesting. And that's another thing. I will piggyback and also say, in answer to some of the questions that have been coming, is thinking about also I've tried really hard not to play too heavy into any one discipline, and I was trying to pay attention to that. So if it was an all two-dimensional show, right, that would be okay, great. But trying to say, like, how is this going to balance out in a variety of ways, whether it's sculptural installation, video, what have you. Any other questions or thoughts? Thank you, everyone. Thank you. It's great to be here.